Thank you. Welcome everyone this evening. I'm Daniel Schrader, Director of the Center for Jewish Studies, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for the Center for Jewish Studies Community Lecture Series. We are honored to have our colleague and faculty member of the Center for Jewish Studies, Pat Ahern-Kroll, speak this evening. Once again, I want to say that I'm sorry that we were unable to hold the event in person at Beth Jacob congregation. We greatly value our community partnerships, and I want to thank Beth Jacob for graciously joining us this evening as our virtual hosts. And again, we certainly would have liked to have been present at Beth Jacob. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Adam Rubin of Beth Jacob, who would like to welcome you to our lecture series this evening and say a few words. Adam.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much. Good evening, everyone. I was also disappointed not to be able to host Professor Ahern-Kroll in person, but I personally, and I know a number of people in our synagogue, are really looking forward to the talk this evening. Beth Jacob congregation has a long history, begun by my distinguished predecessor, Rabbi Morris Allen, of a long history of cooperation with and engagement with the Center for Jewish Studies and the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Religions, Cultures. And we have a number of members in our synagogue who are also professors at the U. And this event tonight, to me, symbolizes what I hope will be a long, the continuation of a long relationship. And we're excited to move into the future and look forward to many events ahead. The talk that Professor Ahern-Kroll will give, to me, it's rooted in a really remarkably interesting time of the Greco-Roman period, the Second Temple, and from I haven't seen your talk ahead of time, but from what I understand, it represents this fascinating paradox of Jews who were immersed in Greco-Roman culture in the Hellenistic world, but at the same time used the very narratives and aspects of that culture to resist some aspects of Hellenistic empire. And that tension between being immersed in a culture and yet insisting on one's own distinctiveness is, of course, something that Jews in the contemporary world are very familiar with, though I'm not sure we'd say we're resisting empire, but nonetheless, many of us feel very comfortable and indeed attached to the culture in which we live, but at the same time seek to assert our own distinctive culture in life. And I'm really looking forward to seeing and hearing how Professor Ahern-Kroll is going to explore this really wonderful and fascinating topic, a world so long ago, but which undoubtedly has echoes in our own time. So again, just very delighted to host the talk and to continue this fruitful relationship with the university. I look forward to the talk.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Rubin. And again, I want to thank our co-sponsors for this evening's lecture, the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Religions and Cultures of the University of Minnesota. And I'm also want to acknowledge the generous gift and memory of Julia Kay and Harold Segal, which has really helped make our community lecture series possible. And special thanks to our staff, Natan Paradise, the Associate Director of the Center, and Mario Coulter, and for all their indispensable work that they do constantly to make things go and keep going. I also want to invite you to visit the Center for Jewish Studies website to find out more about Jewish studies at the University of Minnesota, as well as future events, as well as recordings of past lectures, including tonight's lecture. And I want you to note that our next lecture in the community lecture series by Professor Laura Lieber will not be taking place in person as planned at the Minnesota Hillel, and has moved online. But we do plan to hold our final community lecture of the season on March 30th in person at Mount Zion Temple. So we, of course, invite you to join us for these upcoming events. So it's now my privilege to introduce our colleague, Pat Ahern Kroll, who is an associate professor in the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Religions and Cultures, and a very cherished member of the Center for Jewish Studies faculty at the University of Minnesota. And in fact, Pat is quite an anchor in our Jewish Studies program, teaching important and enriching courses for our students and our program. And I just want to say how path-breaking her scholarship is and how fundamentally important it is for understanding the culture and religious practices of Jews in the Hellenistic and early Roman periods. She is an author, the author of the recently published Aseneth of Egypt, The Composition of a Jewish Narrative. It was published in 2020, and also a translation and commentary on Joseph of Aseneth, and her current book project, in progress, examines the religious practices in Ptolemaic Egypt. So this evening, Professor Ahern Kroll will talk about Jewish novelistic literature before the Mishnah, narrative challenges to empire. So I'd like to turn this over to you, Pat.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to Rabbi Rubin. Thank you for this opportunity to share what I find to be so interesting. So I am going to share my PowerPoint and hope this works out correctly. Oops, went up ahead. And I hope you all see the full slide and not my backup slide. So I hope someone notifies me if that's not right. All right, so this is going to be maybe a little whirlwind at first, but I hope you enjoy. So without further ado, in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham travels to Egypt with Sarah and his household. But what the passage fails to tell us is that Abraham taught astrology to the Egyptian pharaoh, and many who came with Abraham remained in Egypt on account of the land's prosperity. And did you know that Joseph, the son of Jacob, actually obtained prior knowledge of his brother's plot against him, and he voluntarily traveled with an Arab convoy to Egypt? Once there, he was recommended to the king and became the head financial officer of the land. But what may be most surprising to hear is that Moses invented boats and devices for stone construction. He invented Egyptian technology for irrigation and warfare, and Egyptian philosophy and language. He divided the land into 36 nomes, appointed the god to be worshipped in each, and assigned gods as cats, dogs, and ibises. He was loved by the masses and given godlike honors by the Egyptian priests. Some called him Hermes, and the Greeks knew him as Musaeus, who apparently taught the great poet Orpheus. The only one who despised him was Kennephres, the jealous pharaoh and stepfather of Moses. If you are unaware of these stories, you are not alone. We have several examples from the Hellenistic and Roman periods of Jewish narratives that built off of traditional stories about the ancestors and the past. As far as we know, none of these stories became authoritative in later Jewish circles, although one in particular, the Book of Judith, relates to medieval Jewish traditions. But the vast majority lost significance in Jewish circles and instead were incorporated into Christian canons and literature. What I would like to do tonight is to place these narratives in the foreground of when they were composed, during times of imperial growth and conquest, rule and order that tested conquered populations throughout the Near Eastern and Mediterranean world. These stories show us how our writers forged Jewish identity in new contexts and pushed back against the empire, all the while doing so in humorous and entertaining ways. So let us return to my opening example. During the 2nd century BCE, a Jewish writer named Artapanus composed these narratives in Greek under the reign of the Ptolemies in Hellenistic Egypt. Alexander the Great did not achieve his victories alone. He was assisted by several skilled generals. One was Ptolemy, son of Logos, who eventually became Ptolemy I Soter, the first Hellenistic ruler over Egypt. Another general was Seleucus I, who established the Seleucid Empire. Under the Ptolemies, thousands emigrated to Egypt for work and promise, including Jews, and if not Greek-speaking when they had arrived, within a generation or two, they were. Although Greek-speaking inhabitants were the minority, about 5% of the population during the first 2 centuries, they tended to be associated with ranks of influence and wealth. Within the first 2 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, over half of adult Greek-speaking males were associated with the military in some capacity, and many of them became wealthy landowners. From papyrological evidence, so the main documentary evidence, the papyri that has been discovered in Egypt, of the top 10 identifications of soldier immigrants in Ptolemaic Egypt, Judaioi, or that's Jews or Judeans in Greek, are listed as the 3rd most common designation. By the 1st century BCE, thousands of Jews lived in Alexandria, the capital of the Ptolemies, where they had a synagogue that even the later sages talked about. In the countryside, Jewish communities lived up and down the Nile, especially around Memphis, which is roughly modern-day Cairo, and to the west of Memphis in an agriculturally engineered landscape called the Fayum. And this is a close-up of that landscape. Our papyri evidence demonstrates scores of Jews living in villages and cities as soldiers, farmers, shepherds, police personnel, and potters. They had designated prayer houses, and in Heracleopolis, so down here, Heracleopolis, a city at the entrance of the Fayum, we have evidence of a community with its own government, judicial and organizational body called a politeuma in Greek. During this same time, Hebrew biblical texts began being translated into Greek. So the Septuagint is how it's commonly known. And we know that elite Jews in Egypt received a form of Greek education, as evidenced with Philo of Alexandria. Artapanus reflects a similar type of background. He knows the biblical stories about Abraham, Joseph, and Moses in Greek, but he also knows Hellenistic historiography, Egyptian practices, and Ptolemaic rule. Especially in his retelling of Moses, Artapanus apparently knew the historical work on the Egyptians by Hecataeus of Abdera. Hecataeus had apparently traveled throughout Egypt and consulted with Egyptian priests to produce this work. And one story that he relays is about a pharaoh named Sesostris. This Sesostris invented ships, divided the land into 36 nomes, and built a temple in each city for its local god. He fought against the Ethiopians, commanded an army with success, and gained approval from the Egyptian masses. Hecataeus also recounts how Hermes invented the Egyptian language and established the honors to the gods. Isis ordered the priests to consecrate native animals in their districts, to pay honors to them in life, and to provide mortuary rituals for them in death. Artapanus' story about Moses clearly takes from these stories of Hecataeus, and what was assigned to Sesostris, Hermes, and Isis becomes associated with Moses. Hecataeus also tells us that Isis established honors paid to the sacred bull Apis, but Artapanus spins a different tale. In Artapanus's account, Khenephrus, that's Moses' stepfather and pharaoh, visits Memphis with Moses and consults with him about anything else that could benefit humankind. Moses recommends the breed of oxen for tilling the land, but Khenephrus names a bull Apis, commands the people to dedicate a temple to it, and orders that all the animals that Moses had consecrated, the cats, dogs, and ibises I had mentioned earlier, that they be buried at Memphis, so to, quote, conceal the ideas of Moses, end quote. It turns out that Khenephrus is quite envious of Moses, who successfully led the Egyptian army and gained support wherever he went. The key to understanding the story about Moses is the negative portrayal of Apis and other Memphite traditions. The setup of Moses as a Sesostris-like figure is a foil to critique and demote a popular and well-funded cultic life around the Apis bull, who was kept in the temple of Ptah and then buried in the necropolis to the west of the city, where mummified cats, dogs, and ibises were buried, and those represented the gods Bastet, Anubis, and Thoth. During the Ptolemaic period, an Apis bull died about every 20 years. So this is a live bull. And after each death, the priests of the Temple of Ptah would conduct an elaborate set of rituals lasting 70 days. At its conclusion, there would be a public ceremony, and the bull would be taken in a public procession to the necropolis to be buried. This spectacle was grand, and the involvement was high. The sacred complex where the Apis bull was entombed became a popular pilgrimage site, not only for Egyptians, but for Greek immigrants as well. In death, the Apis bull became rejuvenated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife, to become Osiris Apis. As early as the Persian period, Greek inhabitants in Memphis revered this god, and after the rise of the Ptolemies, several associations were made between Osiris Apis and the Greek god Dionysus. The Ptolemies were significant patrons of these Memphite practices. Any inhabitant near Memphis, which includes those living in the Fayum, would have known about the city's main cultic practices. Artapanus critiques the Ptolemaic and Egyptian priesthood establishment in Memphis by narrating that, for spite, Khenephrus created the Apis and the necropolis cultic practices. Khenephrus is clearly the anti-hero in the story, and so the Memphite traditions associated with him are equally unfavorable. As Artapanus tells it, Moses established security and prosperity in Egypt under Khenephrus's reign, which in Egyptian kingship terms means that Moses was a better pharaoh than Khenephrus was. At the same time, Artapanus also rehearses the Exodus narrative. God's call to Moses, Moses's performance of miracles before a different pharaoh, and the Jews' ultimate escape from Egypt all make the story. In the end, much of Egypt's magnificent is destroyed, and the Moses narrative ends with the victory of the Israelite God and deliverance of the Hebrew people from Egypt. Why did Artapanus recount the biblical traditions in this way? Artapanus taps into the intellectual activity among Greek writers who used the cultural landscape of Egypt to produce new identities in the land. As foreign conquerors, the Ptolemies plugged themselves into the legacy of Egyptian culture, and narratives linking Greek heritage to Egypt produced the fiction that the Ptolemies were meant to rule over it. And writers like Hecataeus echoed this theme. But Artapanus wrote from a secondary vantage point. Although he was Greek educated, his ancestral traditions differed from those of Ptolemaic supported institutions. To express the greatness of his heritage, Artapanus spun how Hebrew patriarchs surpassed historic Egyptian leaders. Perhaps the greatest indicator of Jewish dominance lies tucked away in his rendition of the plagues. When Moses strikes the Nile with his staff, the river does not change color, but rather it floods the land. Quote, "It was from that time that the flooding of the Nile began," end quote. The inundation of the Nile was not only essential to the agricultural life of Egypt, but its regularity was used to mark the seasons, guide ritual activity, and signify mythic beginnings. For one of the core features of Egyptian identity, space, and time, Egyptians apparently had Moses to thank. According to Artapanus, the ancestors created the traditions and infrastructures in Egypt that the Ptolemies claimed were connected to them. Another narrative that embeds Jewish ancestors in pharaonic history is the story popularly known as Joseph and Aseneth. In the book of Genesis, after the Pharaoh appoints Joseph as second in command, he also arranges for Joseph to marry Aseneth, the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Shortly thereafter, Aseneth bears Ephraim and Manasseh, who become the tribes that are significant in ancient Israelite history. Genesis makes no comment about Joseph marrying a foreign woman, but later Jewish writers do. The story Joseph and Aseneth is one response to this conundrum, and I'll refer to it as JA from this point forward. So JA is a Greek narrative that frames its plot within the Joseph novella of Genesis, but JA spends considerable time fleshing out Aseneth's story. And what a story it is. Aseneth's beauty is renowned, and although noblemen try to court her, she renounces all men and spends the majority of her time secluded in her wealthy private chambers. She is extremely devout to her Egyptian gods, and she has her own sanctuary where she conducts ritual activity on a daily basis. As Joseph travels the land collecting grain, he decides to visit Aseneth's father, Pentephras. Pentephras decides to arrange the marriage of his daughter to Joseph, and he enthusiastically tells Aseneth about how wonderful Joseph is. Pentephras repeats all of Joseph's positive traits recounted in the Genesis story. He is God-fearing, he is wise, he is chaste, and he tells Aseneth that she will become Joseph's wife. But Aseneth is appalled at this idea, and she repeats other parts of the Genesis story. Joseph is a foreigner. He is a slave who is caught in the act of adultery and imprisoned. No way was she going to marry him. But when Joseph arrives to Pentephras' home, entering the courtyard in his gold chariot and distinguished clothing, Aseneth is thunderstruck. And I quote from the text here, "She was deeply stricken and her soul was broken. Her knees weakened, her whole body trembled, and she groaned aloud." End quote. And she prayed to the God of Joseph to forgive her for her insolence and to make it happen that she marry Joseph. As Aseneth is pleading to God, she's looking down into the courtyard from her window, and Joseph notices her and worries. She is acting like all those other Egyptian women who gape at him and annoy him. Here, our story relates to Jewish traditions which embellish the story about Potiphar's wife and narrate how Egyptian noble women thought Joseph was breathtakingly gorgeous. In J.A., Pentephris convinces Joseph that Aseneth is not like those other women, but when the two greet each other, Joseph refuses to kiss her because it is not fitting for a God-fearing man to kiss a woman who reveres other gods. Aseneth is distraught, and Joseph compassionately prays over her that his God will bless and bring her into God's care. Aseneth responds with relief and joy and then proceeds to change her life radically. Joseph departs soon after, and Aseneth retreats to her chambers, destroys everything related to her religious practices, changes into humble attire, sits in sackcloth and ashes, and fasts for 7 days in seclusion. On day 8, Aseneth issues prayers that echo the genre of lament psalms in the Tanakh. She identifies her lowly status, admits her errors, and affirms the delivering power of God. At daybreak, an angel appears to her, and this angel is described similarly to Gabriel in the book of Daniel. And the angel comes to Aseneth and confirms God's acceptance of her pleas. He tells her that she will be written first in the book of the living, that she will be named City of Refuge, because all those seeking refuge in God will find safe harbor in her, and she will marry Joseph. He concludes his affirmation with a miraculous meal from a honeycomb that both he and she consume, and he departs soon after on a heavenly chariot. Aseneth now is a changed woman. When Joseph returns again, he is struck by her beauty and immediately embraces her. They marry soon after, and she bears Ephraim and Manasseh. But the trauma is not over. It turns out that Pharaoh's son had wanted Aseneth as his wife, and he plots an ambush to kill Joseph and kidnap Aseneth. He first tries to enlist Levi and Simeon. He had heard of their exploits at Shechem, referring to Genesis 34, and he offers the two great reward if they assist him. But they adamantly refuse because, quote, "it is not fitting for God-fearing men to repay evil for evil." Pharaoh's son does not give up, and he successfully enlists the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, who, in J.A., feel like second-class citizens in Jacob's family. The plan is set that Pharaoh's son will murder his father and kidnap Aseneth, while the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah will kill Joseph. Pharaoh's son provides hundreds of soldiers for each brother to command, and they lie in wait along a road in the countryside where Aseneth will soon be traveling. As you can guess, the plan is thwarted. Pharaoh's son runs into interference when he tries to kill his father. Benjamin, who is traveling with Aseneth, uses his David-like stone-throwing skills to knock out Pharaoh's son and kill his accompanying Egyptian forces. Levi and the other sons of Leah single-handedly defeat the forces of Dan, Gad, Naphtali, and Asher, and these sons of Bilhah and Zilpah flee, and they ultimately corner Aseneth. But Aseneth calls upon God, who then dissolves the men's swords, and immediately the men fall to the ground and plead to Aseneth to save them. In this scene, Aseneth becomes what the angel renamed her to be. She becomes a refuge for these traitorous brothers. When Levi and the sons of Leah arrive on the scene, they are eager to kill the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, but Aseneth changes their minds, repeating the maxim, "It is not fitting for God-fearing people to repay evil for evil." Convinced by Aseneth, Levi then stops Benjamin from killing Pharaoh's son. They both tend to his wounds, and when they bring Pharaoh's son back to the Pharaoh bows before Levi in gratitude. Pharaoh's son, however, does not survive his injuries, and Pharaoh passes away soon after, having become weak from his sorrow. Pharaoh leaves his rulership under Joseph's control because the next heir was too young to take the throne. And so Joseph reigns for 48 years in Egypt. And afterwards, he transfers his power to Pharaoh's descendant. The author of this narrative not only drew upon Greek biblical texts, Genesis, the book of Psalms, and the book of Daniel, but also upon Greek fictional narratives called Greek novels. These novels typically portray noble protagonists, male and female, who ultimately fall in love, but whose union is obstructed several times in the plot. The characterizations can be extreme, where both the male and female protagonists express a range of emotions and appear to respond quite dramatically to the challenges that they face. But the protagonists also convey superhuman qualities. They are incredibly good looking and destined to do great things, and they ultimately marry each other. These novels also spend considerable time on the female protagonist. So as you can see, J.A. shares all these features. But J.A. also makes a move akin to that of Artapanus. Both Aseneth and Joseph are written into the pharaonic history of Egypt, which is a move that Ptolemaic rulers made during their rule over Egypt. They represented themselves as pharaohs on temple reliefs and with statues. And so the image on the left is of Ptolemy VIII and his wife. They were incorporated alongside the gods in Egyptian ritual activity, and they communicated their rule in Egyptian terms, which appears, for example, in the Rosetta Stone in the image on your right. Like Artapanus's work, J.A. portrays Jewish ancestry in Egypt positively, but also supplants the Ptolemies in the process. Joseph and Aseneth were a pharaonic couple way before the Ptolemies ever set foot on the land. The story also instructs about what is God-fearing behavior. Intermarriage is acceptable if the non-Jew forsakes her or his allegiance to other gods and commits only to the Jewish God. The fact that Aseneth is Egyptian is never an issue in the story. What matters is that she changed her allegiance to only the God of Joseph. J.A. also maintains that God-fearers do not repay evil for evil, even with matters of violence or aggression, and even if perpetuated by kin. The hostility that is expressed in J.A. never has to do with religious affiliation or ethnic identity. At its heart is the conclusion that one actor insulted the other, and in Ptolemaic legal documents, we have ample evidence of plaintiffs raising complaints about such kind hostility. We can glean from these documents, which number in the hundreds, is that local life in Egypt entailed the same kinds of struggles that exist today. People cheating others out on agreements, people verbally abusing others, or robbing or attacking them, or worse. People from all sectors of society produce these complaints, including women and including Jews. From Heracleopolis, the city with the politeuma I mentioned earlier, we know that Jews also filed these complaints, some against fellow Jews and some not. Within the context of Egypt, J.A. promotes the action of restraint in the face of hostility as a strategy for living in Egypt, and it associates this behavior with what it means to observe God. My final example comes from a different location in the ancient world. The book of Judith likely hails from Hellenistic Palestine, or what then was referred to as Coal Syria and Phoenicia, which included Judea. And so sorry about the map, it's the best I could find, but it's this region here, Coal Syria, Phoenicia, that includes Judea. The story may have first been composed in Hebrew, but if so, it soon was translated into Greek. The Greek composition of the story demonstrates knowledge of Septuagint style prose and of Greek historical traditions, such that of the historian Herodotus, who is a Persian period Greek writer, famous for a work called the Histories. It is quite possible that this text was produced as a Greek text from a Greek-educated Jewish author. Let me first summarize the narrative. So my main point is that it might have been Hebrew at first, but it's so overwhelmingly with Greek style that most scholars are now seeing it as a Greek composition. So the story. It begins in the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh. In his Chaldean expansion of power, he engaged in battle against the Medes and sent messengers to all in the west, including Judea, to join him in his fight. But the Western nations refused. And after Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Medes, he strategized revenge upon the West. He appoints his chief general Holofernes to lead a military campaign against all these territories to punish them for disobeying his orders. Holofernes, the general of the Assyrians, departs with his sizable force and marches through Syria, terrorizing every place past Damascus and causing fear in cities all along the Mediterranean coast. So, if you find this story disorienting so far, then you are raising the right questions. There was no Nebuchadnezzar of the Assyrian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar II, was the first ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the one that had exiled those in Judah and destroyed Jerusalem and its temple. In fact, the book of Judith presents several anachronisms. The story reports that the Jews had recently returned to their land and rebuilt the temple. So Persian period is when this happened, but the story is taking place in Assyrian period, and you can see my list on the slide. It's all jumbled in terms of chronology. Judith also refers to unattested locations, the borders of Japheth, for example, to unattested peoples, the Resacites, and to biblical tribal associations that did not exist in the Hellenistic period, like the Ammonites or the Gileadites. One question scholars ask about ancient novelistic literature is whether they were composed as fiction, whether listeners or readers would understand the narrative as such. There is no debate with Judith. The purposeful conflation of references in this story is a foil for talking about other matters, and those matters seem to relate to the Hellenistic period. So let us return to our story. Holofernes successfully creates panic among the city-states, and he ends up destroying their sanctuaries and gods. He declares that all nations should worship Nebuchadnezzar alone, and that all dialects and tribes shall call upon him as a god. He then marches southward towards Judea and camps on the northern edge by the main mountain pass that leads to Judea and Jerusalem. Those in Judea are alarmed, and the high priest Joachim sends orders to a number of districts to seize hilltops and fortify villages, and he sends words to the cities Bethulia and Betomesthaim to seize the mountain passes to block the foreign invasion. Now, these two cities are fictional, and the geography described here is exaggerated. There was no narrow mountain pass that made attacking Judea from the north difficult. The scene here is simply to set up the climax of the story. So Holofernes is enraged at Judea's tactics, and he summons an Ammonite leader named Achior to give him more information about this Jewish people. Achior then recounts their history from the Jewish people's ancestral beginnings in Chaldea through the divine punishment of the exile and the present, where they have returned because of God's favor over his people. Holofernes will only be successful, Achior tells him, if the people have sinned against their God. Otherwise, he will fail in his exploits. Holofernes angrily rejects Achior's advice, banishes him from the camp, and foolishly sends him away to die in Judean territory, which turns out to be at the city of Bethulia. After Achior informs the elders of Bethulia about Holofernes' plans, the city's population welcomes Achior and prays to God to help. But meanwhile, Holofernes' armies is depleting Bethulia's resources. They take over water supplies, they block any trade, and intimidate the city with its military presence. The people of Bethulia continue to pray to God for help, but they become distraught and complain to the elders to act. The chief elder, Uzziah, urges everyone to keep courage and wait for God. But he promises, Uzziah, that if nothing happens in 5 days, he will surrender to Holofernes. And this promise leads Judith to act. Judith is a wealthy widow of Bethulia who is devout, stunningly beautiful, and respected by all in the city. She publicly scolds Uzziah and the elders for their poor leadership and describes their fate as a test by God. The people of Bethulia need to be an example for their kindred. Their actions will not only defend their people, but also the sanctuary in Jerusalem. Judith concludes saying that she is about to do something that will go down in history. She will leave that night with her slave, and within days, the Lord will deliver Israel by her hand. Just don't try to find out what I'm doing, she tells them. She returns home and prays to God to give her strength to carry through with her plan. She changes into expensive garb and jewelry, enhancing her appearance so to entice all men who may see her, and she departs with her female slave who carries food and drink. Judith and her slave go towards the enemy camp and are captured and brought before Holofernes. Judith lies to him, saying that she will help Holofernes defeat Judea, and the guards in Holofernes are too mesmerized by her beauty to detect her deception. Judith asserts that Achior's message was correct, but falsely says that her people were beginning to break dietary and tithing practices because of the scarcity of food and drink in the city. As Devorah Levine-Guerra aptly puts it, Judith is weaving a blatantly false tale for a non-Jew who is ignorant of Israelite law and practices. Judith proposes that she will be his divination expert, that every night she and her slave must be allowed to leave the camp, and she will pray to God and discover when the people have sinned against God. She would then lead Holofernes into Judea and Jerusalem because God will allow his forces to take over. Holofernes agrees to the plan, and Judith proceeds for 3 days, living in the camp and going out in the evenings to pray. On the 4th day, Holofernes is dying to be intimate with Judith, and he arranges for a private banquet with her. Judith dresses to the hilt and joins him in his tent, eating and drinking her own food, but giving Holofernes the impression that his passion will soon be fulfilled. Holofernes ends up drinking too much, and after his slaves withdraw from the tent, Judith prays to God, saying, "O Lord God of all might, look in this hour on the work of my hands for the exaltation of Jerusalem. Now indeed is the time to help your heritage and to carry out my design, to destroy the enemies who have risen up against us." As Holofernes lays passed out in his bed, Judith reaches for his sword and strikes off his head and wraps it with the bedding. She then walks out of the camp, and with her slave, with the head of Holofernes concealed, Judith leaves under the pretense of going off to pray, but instead they return to Bethulia and declare victory. Judith assures the city that it was only her face that had seduced Holofernes, that nothing else had happened, but the Lord has struck the commander of the Assyrian army, she says, by the hand of a woman. Judith takes charge and commands the city people what to do next. They hang Holofernes' head from the city wall, and armed, able-bodied men rush out pursuing the Assyrian army, who inevitably panic at the discovery of Holofernes' demise. Jewish fighters from nearby cities join in, and the Assyrian army is eliminated. Joachim, the high priest, blesses Judith, calling her the glory of Jerusalem, and Judith, like a general, receives all of Holofernes' elite items from the plundered Assyrian camp. All the women of Judea gather and bless her, and Judith leads everyone in the celebration that concludes in Jerusalem. And no one ever again spread terror among the Israelites during the lifetime of Judith or for a long time after her death. The story closes. There is much to unpack from this story, so I will highlight just a few points. The book of Judith shares affinities with Joseph and Aseneth. It focuses on a female protagonist, and some of the characters, in this case, many of the males, express a range of emotions. As I'm guessing for most of you, the book of Esther hovers in the background of this story's design. And some of you may also know the very old story of Daniel, his son Akat, and his daughter Pagit, who slayed the killer of Akat in ways similar to how Judith brought down Holofernes. But the book of Judith is quite transparent about being a fiction, and the power of its critique lies in this fact. Through her actions and her speech, Judith is touted as a model Jewish leader. Even though God is not an active character, the plot unfolds implying God's favor with Judith. Judith doesn't wait for God to miraculously act. She uses her resources and military strategy to bring about victory. Her purposes not only are to protect the Jewish people, but also to defend the Jerusalem temple. The threat before Judea then is a threat against religious practices and identity, as indicated by Holofernes destroying the sanctuaries of neighboring peoples and declaring that only Nebuchadnezzar should be worshipped. Judith, in fact, sounds a lot like the stories about Judas Maccabeus. During the early decades of Hasmonean rule, we have accounts that narrate the events leading to Judean autonomy in the 2nd century BCE. The book of First Maccabees tells the story from a pro-Hasmonean view, in which the early Maccabean leaders were backed by divine favor, defended Jerusalem and the Jewish people, and established themselves as Judean Hellenistic rulers. In the book of 2nd Maccabees, however, the focus is on Judas. God actively intervenes to help him defend the temple. Judas reinstates religious practices at the temple, declares the annual celebration of Hanukkah, and he successfully defeats the Seleucid military general Nicanor. Judas orders the decapitation of Nicanor and displayed the general's mutilated body in Jerusalem as a sign of God's assistance. This event was commemorated by an annual festival called Nicanor's Day that continued into the 1st century CE. 2nd Maccabees does not praise the Maccabeans who became rulers. It stops at the leadership of Judas, who lived only at the start of the 20+ years of the Judean-Seleucid War. 2nd Maccabees hearkens to the founder of the revolt, sidelining the Hasmonean rulers in its memory and elevating other Jewish models. Our earliest accounts of the martyrdom of the mother and her 7 sons takes place in this story, and there are other Jews whose determination and obedience to God are praised. 2nd Maccabees removes the construction of Jewish identity from Hasmonean authority and places it in the hands of Jews in the 1st Maccabean leader, Judas. Many scholars see the book of Judith arguing a similar but more scathing point. In the book of Judith, the 2 figures who best understand the ways of God are Judith, the Jewish widow, and Achior, the Ammonite general who takes Judea's side. The city leadership of Bethulia display poor leadership and cowardly behavior, and the only other Jewish leader in the text, Joachim, the high priest, is distant in most of the story. The word Judith in Greek means female Jew, Judith, and it could also echo Judas's name in the Greek, Judas. Judith, however, is not connected to the beginning of the Hasmonean line, yet she upholds everything that Judas was said to have achieved. The book of Judith was likely composed around 100 BCE, around the time of Hasmonean expansionist policies and repression of dissenting Jews. So this is during the time of John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus. This time period saw tremendous growth in Judea, which included enhanced political diplomacy abroad, economic and intellectual growth at home, and greater oversight and patronage of the temple cult. But in some ways, the Hasmoneans were not so different from other Hellenistic rulers, and their response to opposition could be violent, as with Jannaeus against the Pharisees. In this context, the book of Judith pointedly presents what Guerra calls a twofold victory. It celebrates the ultimate defeat of foreign empires and the victory of God of Israel, but it also declares victory over fellow Jews whose actions and leadership are wanting. In this case, then, Judith pushes back against all sovereignties in the Hellenistic period, Seleucid and Hasmonean alike. The stories I have recounted for you this evening were preserved by Christian scribes, and one of them, Joseph and Aseneth, became incorporated into Armenian Christian Bibles. Some facets of the Judith story lived on in Jewish circles into the medieval period. The works of the sages do not mention them, but beginning around the 10th century CE, Judith is mentioned in literary texts like in the Piyutim, and she appears in images that are associated with Hanukkah, like this menorah. The Judith of our Greek text, though, fell away from Jewish tradition, especially its active portrayal of the heroine and its pointed critique of Hasmonean rule. The fading of the stories I have rehearsed was most likely gradual, as was the decline of Greek-speaking Jewish communities in the ancient Mediterranean world. In the end, why later Jewish communities did not transmit and repeat these traditions is a complicated story. What I hoped to show to you tonight is that Jewish writers in the Hellenistic period created powerful stories of heroism, obedience, and victory in the face of imperial domination. These writers used the rhetorical tools of their day to supplant stories of superiority that foreign rule promoted. Their narrations elevated ancestral traditions in a new way, and at least in words, they fought back against political structures that diminished the greatness of the Jewish people and their God. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Such an interesting talk and wonderful stories, I think, which are really very unknown to many of us, not having become so much a part, I think, of the Jewish tradition. So I'd like to open this up for questions, comments. We have a little time to talk a little bit further. So please let me know if you have questions. Please submit them in Q&A.
I'm interested to know if anyone had ever heard of Artapanus. That's usually the surprise that I get when I present that he created the gods for Egypt.
Well, it was new to me for sure. Maybe I will pose a question. In a way, you've been looking at a rather long period of time, or relatively, or several hundred years. And of course, there were different kinds of interactions between Jews, and depending on their location, I'm sure the situation in Alexandria was very different than, let's say, in Judea and so forth. But I think one of the really fascinating things that which this reveals in these stories and this literature reveals is this kind of, on the one hand, I think as you concluded, there's a kind of, it's kind of, they reflect a kind of response to power in the area, kind of an assertion of an identity. But I think on the other end, it also shows a kind of, interaction where the boundaries are really, kind of fluid in a way, or the subtext seems to suggest that. And of course, I think in the larger Jewish tradition, there's always a sense of, sort of Greeks pitted against Jews and so forth. So anyway, I think this is so interesting how it reveals, what might seem, at least to someone who's not a specialist in this area, is a kind of paradox. Just a comment, or maybe a question. I see that we have a few questions and comments from Doris Rubenstein. We have a question. Thanks, very interesting. Do you think that the stories of these women fell out of favor due to the minimalization of women in Jewish religious life in the Middle Ages? I have heard of Aseneth. I had a classmate in elementary school by that name. Oh, goodness.
Yeah, so Dvorah Levine Guerra, one of the things I'll do when this is posted on the Center for Jewish Studies, I was going to provide a bibliography for people who wanted to read more. And so I'll also provide, I'll answer the Artapanis in a second. But Dvorah Levine Guerra has written really interesting material about how Judith lives on. And so Judith continues to be important, like in the PU team. I want to ask Lord Lieber this when she comes, about Judith and the PU team. But she's not as powerful, assertive a figure as you go into medieval traditions as you get in the Greek book of Judith. So I haven't studied this, but I find it interesting that her agency kind of goes down, or she gets incorporated with the Hasmonean. It becomes a Hasmonean story. And so the critique the book of Judith is making about the Hasmoneans, that falls away in the traditions of Judith later on. And that's great. You knew an Aseneth. I've never met an Aseneth, so that's great. And who read these stories? Any connection to development of the Mishnah? So, that's such an interesting piece. So when I said that the sages don't mention this stuff, I don't know of any references to these stories or storylines in any of the rabbinic material, Mishnaic or Talmudim. And so it is interesting how you have Judith on the one hand, something about Judith live on, and these other traditions don't make the cut. And I don't know what to say about that. There is interesting, and I had to cut my talk, but I was going to mention that Joseph and Aseneth was translated into Syriac, and so is Judith. And there's just now scholars more and more are looking at Jewish intellectuals and Christian intellectuals in the East, because there is this there's somewhat of a cross-pollination with Jewish Aramaic and Christian Syriac traditions that it would be interesting to see if some of these stories maybe did get picked up that we don't know of yet. And the Artapanus outside the Bible is a very large, it's a 2-volume series. That is where my commentary on Joseph and Aseneth is, but there is Eric Gruen writes the commentary for Artapanus, and that's probably the best place to get it. But I will, again, I'll provide a bibliography that we'll post for those who want to read up on these. They're fun to read.
Yeah. I see there's a question from Shiralone. Thank you, Pat, for introducing such fascinating materials. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the sources you're working with. Are there many manuscripts of these novels? Are they singular? How early are the extant sources? Who was their initial audience? And I see there are another couple questions about the intended audience as well. So questions about the sources and audience.
Yeah, okay. Wow, thank you, Cher. This is what my book is on. So I won't bore you all with the details, but so Joseph and Aseneth, there's 91 manuscripts of this story, and it's not all the same. And so my rendition I gave you is kind of the common denominator. There's a lot that's shared where you can get this core narrative, but you clearly see in the transmission of the story that scribes were creative, and they added and adapted and shifted things around. The thing with Joseph and Aseneth is that it's preserved by Christian scribes. So my argument that it's a Jewish narrative is what most Second Temple scholars agree with, but one could argue that it was written much later as a Christian narrative. And there are a few scholars who make that argument. I see way too much associated with Ptolemaic Egypt I just think it makes a tons of sense for it to be in Egypt. And so the original audience I have in mind are people like Artapanus, people in Egypt, Jewish communities in Egypt. I mean, there are 13, so epigraphical evidence. So these are inscriptions in stones of prayer houses all along the countryside of Jewish prayer houses. And I imagine that, there's definitely Greek educated Jews in Ptolemaic Egypt. And so my imagine is that this is composed and shared and taught and read, building up stories of legacy traditions. And in part because Jews for centuries were living fairly well in Egypt. This goes downhill when Rome takes over, but during Ptolemaic period, there's a lot of thriving. And so how do you make sense of having your ancestral traditions talk about this despotic Egypt and you're thriving in that place? And so I think it's also trying to do that, have these positive stories. Did I answer the manuscript thing? So Judith, same thing, where we have several different manuscripts. We do have closer in time, because it does make the major codices of the Septuagint. So we're talking 4th, 5th century CE. Artapanus is a little tougher because his story is in fragments preserved by Eusebius, who is a Christian author in the 5th century. So his is the hardest one to peg.
Well, it's really fascinating. I wonder why the Judith story gets revived in the 11th century, which
Yeah.
is, or it was at the 11th century, I think you said that.
10th, 11th century, yeah.
But I think I guess it must reflect some other kinds of interactions, with Christians and Christianity, and so
Mm.
it's interesting how what stories remain and what stories and what the reasons for stories being kind of revisited in different sort of cultural contexts or historical contexts. This is so interesting. I think we need to bring our meeting to a close, but I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and especially to Pat for bringing us such a wonderful lecture this evening. So thank you, Pat, and thank you everyone for coming here this evening. And we hope to see you. Hope to see you at the next lecture in our series. And thank you, Pat.
Yep, you're welcome. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.